February 7, 1964. When he first lands, America welcomes John Lennon with open arms.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did.
But by the time the 1960s end, John Lennon has the U.S. government after him.
The Lennons were on tape machines and phone buggers.
He is always the political one.
Apathy, isn't it?
All power to the people.
This is the story of the Beatles who won't compromise.
The FBI took down the words to the songs that Lennon sang.
It's the story of government agents who fear he might be involved in plots to disrupt a presidential election.
No one is above the law.
It's the story of singers, spies, and secrets that remain hidden.
He was one of those allegedly dangerous radicals who the United States wanted to get rid of.
They're even changing their own rules.
This is the kind of treatment we would dish out to anybody.
This is John Lennon, Declassified. March 1966. The Beatles have conquered America, but America is about to bite back.
The Beatles were absolutely a cosmic force. I believe that there was something above, call it whatever you may, that was being channeled through them.
Their effect on the fans is electric and unprecedented. It has a name: Beatlemania. 1966. John Lennon talks about the crush of fans in a newspaper interview, in which he observes, "We're more popular than Jesus now." His comments about religion and rock hit the media in the United States, and John Lennon is now more than just another pop star.
When John made that statement about the Beatles were bigger than Christ, and that's when everybody took notice of John, because he was the most outspoken of the four guys. He would just speak whatever was on his mind. So I guess in this sense, he was always going to be watched more closely than any of the others.
His controversial statements play very poorly in the Bible Belt. And though he goes to great lengths to apologize and explain that he is not anti-religious, his reputation as a rebel and a troublemaker has begun. In some cases, the reaction to John Lennon is frightening.
If you, as an American teenager, are offended by statements from a group of foreign singers which strike at the very basis of our existence as God-fearing, patriotic citizens, then we urge you to take your Beatle records, pictures, and souvenirs to the pickup points about to be named. On the night of the Beatles' appearance in Memphis, August 19th, they will be destroyed in a huge public bonfire at a place to be named soon.
I just didn't mean what everybody thinks I meant, you know. I'm not anti-Christ or anti-religion or anti-God, you know. We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time. I wasn't knocking it or putting it down, I was just saying it as a fact. If it had said television is more popular than Jesus, I might have got away with it.
Concern about security during the Beatles' tour of America is high, but slowly the controversy fades. Nevertheless, John Lennon has made an impression in the United States.
The thing about John is, yeah, he was a bashful and shy person, but he also said what he thought all the time. He was fearless in terms of expressing his point of view, and he never saw an object of authority that he didn't want to rebel against or knock down.
John Lennon's talent for controversy is one thing that will lead the U.S. government to label him a subversive.
Your haircuts are un-American. Well, it was very observant of them, because we aren't American, actually.
John Lennon just had a very different sensibility. I think he was, by nature, sardonic and sarcastic.
It seems a bit silly to be in America and for none of them to mention Vietnam as if nothing was happening.
His statements about religion and society aren't the only controversies about John Lennon. His involvement with the artist Yoko Ono still prompts fights among Beatles fans.
Yoko could be very intimidating. She was very mysterious to the majority of the folks that worked for her. It was obvious that John was madly in love with her and she was madly in love with him. She turned out to be his wife, his lover, his mother, his collaborator, his investment banker.
She's a lovely mother to me, a lovely mother. Well, that's too long, you see. I only want one line.
I know, but you see, in Japanese, I know.
October 18th, 1968. London police raid a flat belonging to Beatles drummer Ringo Starr. John and Yoko are living there at the time.
John and Yoko, of course, the first time I know of them sort of having trouble with authority is when they were arrested for dope at Ringo had this sort of cellar or first floor place somewhere in London.
The raid is led by Detective Sergeant Norman Pilcher, who has already made headlines by busting the Rolling Stones and other rock stars on drug charges.
The Beatles' worldwide popularity had crested, and it had become time to tear down that which we had created. I think John Lennon and the Beatles then became very obvious targets for the establishment. They were no longer the Fab Four, the Mop Tops. They were men who had to be brought down to size.
John and Yoko at first refuse to let the police in, but when they do, a drug-sniffing dog discovers a small quantity of hashish, or marijuana resin, hidden in a trunk.
John was quite noble, of course, aside from announcing publicly how misused and abused they had been. He took full responsibility for everything, saying that Yoko had nothing to do with anything.
Everywhere in the world now, the musicians are gigging, you know.
Lennon is only fined the equivalent of a couple $100 for the offense, but the drug bust will haunt him years later in America. In 1968, at the same time John and Yoko are fighting drug charges in London, in America, student protesters are passionately battling the U.S. government over the Vietnam War. It's an election year, and that summer many take their anti-war assault to the Democratic National Convention in Chicago.
Mayor Daley refused permits for what would have been a very, very large demonstration. So it became a struggle to maintain the right to protest in the streets when the permits were suspended, which meant you could be arrested at any moment. That led to about 5 days of street confrontations. One person killed, many people beaten up, even reporters, because they didn't want the world to see this.
Tom Hayden is a member of the Chicago 7, protest leaders who are being tried for conspiracy.
The chief street tactician is Tom Hayden, student leader.
But you're going to march in?
Are you expecting trouble?
We expect to march.
What does
we expect trouble all the time. We're coming to Chicago by the tens of thousands, whether or not there are any permits given.
After Nixon was elected a few months later, having promised to put an end to this disorder, our case came to the top of the list, and we were indicted and accused of conspiring, which legally meant operating in parallel, to create these riots at the convention.
In 1969, the charges against the Chicago 7 fall apart on appeal. Newly elected President Richard M. Nixon states that law and order are his priority.
I'm against violence, you know, period. Violence begets violence, as far as I'm concerned. It's been proved by what's going on in the States and the protest marches in Grosvenor Square in London.
John and Yoko are openly dismissive of violent protests. As performers and artists, they create media events like their Bed-Ins for Peace in Amsterdam and Montreal.
I'm using my money and my time to promote peace. And when the money runs out and the time runs out, we should have peace by then.
But it is not the peace movement that will bring John Lennon and Yoko Ono to America. They will come in search of Yoko's daughter, Kyoko Cox.
Kyoko Cox was Yoko Ono's daughter by her first marriage to her husband, Tony Cox. I remember Kyoko being a beautiful little girl. One day, Kyoko and Tony Cox disappeared into the ether.
John and Yoko have to follow them to the States if they ever expect to see Kyoko again. March 23, 1970. John Lennon and Yoko Ono fly to New York to look for Yoko's daughter. It is there that they hold court with the radical left, and it is there that the FBI picks up their trail. Despite their avowed commitment to peace, they are about to become part of a very dangerous game. September 1971. Mainstream America doesn't really trust John Lennon. From his comments about the Beatles and religion to his recent UK drug bust, he is not the Liverpool heartthrob they'd welcomed a few years earlier. Now, he's back in the States on a mission.
Yoko was desperately trying to find Kyoko, a daughter she had with a previous husband, Tony Cox, who had taken her away and was hiding her.
Neither John nor Yoko are citizens of the United States, and neither one of them knows how to find Tony Cox and Kyoko. Their search will go on for years.
I think it was a very personal issue with John and Yoko in trying to find Kyoko. I do believe that they had put private detectives on the case.
1971. John and Yoko set themselves up in New York in order to find Kyoko and make a life for themselves in America. Almost immediately, they are courted by hip and radical New Yorkers like Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman, two of Hayden's fellow Chicago 7 members. They don't quite realize what they're letting themselves in for.
They were involved with the Black Panthers. They were supportive of the Chicago 7. I mean, I saw people hanging around the apartment all the time. Jerry Rubin, Bobby Seale, Angela Davis.
Subsequently declassified FBI files show the Bureau is already spying on some of John and Yoko's new friends.
You have to realize what's going on.
These are the champions of the left in the U.S. and of protest and revolution.
These are the people I read in the newspaper. I would not think that I was going to see them, but there they were. And I mean, there'd be times where, I think it was Angela Davis's birthday or something, and Yoko would say to me, well, take this present and bring it on over to her tonight. And I said, okay, never thinking anything about it except, wow, I'm going to be taking this to a person I'm reading about in the newspaper.
The biggest star is John Lennon himself. Rubin and Hoffman try to persuade him to support or even headline at their events.
I was the little innocent one, because I was, I guess, the little straight one, so they always trusted me to doing all the different things around with John and Yoko. I didn't think about the danger, so I didn't sense it, but I also knew that there was something out there.
The FBI and the Justice Department are taking note of Lennon's friendships. Activists like Angela Davis, Jerry Rubin, and Abby Hoffman are already tagged as dangerous subversives by the Bureau.
So there was a full court press by the best and brightest of our intelligence agencies to quell these disturbances by any means necessary.
Violent and even non-violent protests in the 1960s inspire a lot of fear in American society. The FBI secretly opens files on political opponents of the government, including people like John Lennon. It is only years later that files are declassified and the protesters learn of the constant surveillance.
I finally got my FBI files that were collected on me, 22,000 pages worth, through 1976. And the first file was when I was an innocent student editorial writer at the University of Michigan. I had made a critical comment about the House Un-American Activities Committee, and an FBI agent clipped it, sent it to J. Edgar Hoover.
The existence of the FBI files on people like Tom Hayden and John Lennon is an open secret in American society. But to this day, no one can say how many files were created. They are the records of the agency Americans depend upon to combat domestic terrorism and interstate crimes.
The FBI was also responsible, and the FBI is responsible today for any kind of threat against the United States from within as well as from without. So if you have radical groups, or if you have groups that want to overthrow the U.S. government, for example, or they want to engage in terrorism, that all comes under the umbrella of the FBI.
The leaders of the left in the 1960s are a threat to the policies of then-President Richard Nixon and the FBI's longtime director, J. Edgar Hoover.
During the J. Edgar Hoover period, the FBI tended to confuse legitimate political dissent with efforts to overthrow the government. So if somebody, for example, demonstrated against the Vietnam War and didn't like the government, he immediately came under suspicion from the FBI.
Jerry Rubin. This is like a dream.
December 1971. Jerry Rubin talks John and Yoko into participating in a concert to benefit a radical named John Sinclair.
John Sinclair was a political activist in Michigan who was sentenced to 10 years in jail for possession of 2 marijuana cigarettes. Obviously, it wasn't the marijuana cigarettes that got him that sentence, it was his political convictions. John was contacted, actually it was Yoko, was contacted by Jerry Rubin and asked if he would go up and sing at this benefit concert that was put together to draw attention to the plight of this guy who was in jail for 10 years for this almost misdemeanor.
Rubin sees it as the first stop on a national anti-Nixon tour.
This rally is going to be the first of prison rallies all across this country, demanding that they lay down the bars and let all the prisoners out.
This program is not for winding down the war. Thing, nowhere,
Richard Nixon.
Getting rid of Richard Nixon.
This man Nixon and his war makers.
Everybody knows.
And I wish that Nixon knew it.
It was called the Free John Sinclair Concert. That was the first time that they tried to connect this project of anti-war organizing with music. It was a fantastic event. Stevie Wonder, Commander Cody, MC5. They had speeches by Jerry Rubin, by Bobby Seale, leaders of the New Left.
The only solution to pollution is a people's humane revolution. Selling heroin.
Using the fame and influence of these artists, organizers like Jerry Rubin hope to mobilize demonstrations against the Vietnam War as part of a nationwide tour. A tour that will end with tens of thousands of protesters at the Republican Convention in San Diego in August of 1972. If Rubin has his way, this action at the Republicans' convention will make Chicago 1968 look like a quiet Sunday in the park.
We came here not only to help John and to spotlight what's going on, but also to show and to say to all of you that apathy isn't it, and that we can do something.
The FBI was in the audience, took down every word that every person said, including the words to the songs that Lennon sang on that occasion. Since this was the kind of trial run of the kind of concert they were hoping to do in lots of other places, it's very significant.
The possibility of a dozen or more anti-war concerts makes Lennon the object of even more scrutiny and spying. He is traveling with a rough and radical crowd. The FBI suspects he is interested in the overthrow of the government. John Lennon's FBI file is beginning to grow. January 1972, New York City. Richard Nixon is president, and he is presiding over some of the most violent and tragic days of the Vietnam War. John Lennon and Yoko Ono have joined forces with some of the anti-war movement's most famous lights, and they've inspired the FBI to open a new file on them.
John wasn't just perceived as a threat. John was a real threat to the United States because he wanted to use his power as the gigantic celebrity that he was, and who had the ear of hundreds of millions of people around the world, to try to bring the war to the end.
From the perspective of the FBI, the radical social change proposed by activists in the late 1960s and early 1970s seems to threaten law and order. Riots and bombings have torn society apart, and a charismatic leader like John Lennon could sway many to action.
This was significant because 1972 was the first year that 18-year-olds were given the right to vote in the United States. Before that, it was 21. Everybody thought young people were a strong anti-war constituency and therefore an anti-Nixon constituency, but also it was widely believed that young people were not that likely to register and vote. So the problem was, if you were at least in the anti-Nixon camp, the anti-war camp, how to register young people to take advantage of this opportunity. Lennon wanted to help.
Bring you a message of peace and love. John Lennon and Yoko.
One possible target of a street action by the left is the Republican convention, slated to take place in August of 1972.
There was endless cabals taking place with Jerry Rubin and Bobby Seale and all. And the idea was to, you know, break up the convention.
The Vietnam War grinds on. The protests grow more violent, and the government reaction grows more oppressive. Declassified FBI memos show the government's increasing frustration with protesters.
This is an FBI memo dated May 27th, 1966. It says that in trying to expose, disrupt, and otherwise neutralize the activities of the New Left, the Bureau was faced with a rather unique task, because first, the New Left is difficult to actually define, and second, because of the complete disregard by New Left members for moral and social laws and social amenities. It is believed that the nonconformism in dress and speech, the neglect of personal cleanliness, the use of obscenities, printed and uttered, publicized sexual promiscuity, experiments with the use of drugs, filthy clothes, shaggy hair, wearing of sandals, beads, and unusual jewelry tend to negate any attempt to hold these people up to ridicule.
But there's one big difference between John Lennon and anti-war protesters like Tom Hayden. John Lennon is not an American citizen. Rich and powerful as he is, John Lennon is in the country on a temporary visa. John Lennon can be pushed. Exactly how John Lennon is being watched is a mystery in 1972. He and Yoko and their circle have their suspicions, but it will be decades before those files begun at the Free John Sinclair concert are fully declassified.
John was constantly, it's hard to say exactly, but we perceive that he was constantly, certainly in the States, having the line tapped. There was one guy out front in Bank Street who was taking apart and putting together a motorcycle forever. I'm absolutely sure it was his job to be there.
It's kind of strange, and to look back, it's like, I was in danger and I had no idea. My phones were tapped. I kept hearing clicks on the phone, never thinking in a million years that that could be somebody tapping into my lines as well.
Occasionally, I mean, when I would call, for example, he'd, say things like, be careful, the phone's being tapped. And, ha, ha, ha. But I think there was some truth behind it.
John and Yoko even talked about surveillance on national television with Dick Cavett.
I think it was a given that the Lennons were on little screens and tape machines and phone buggers and all kinds of things. Those things are famously done to people like them. The ongoing two-headed monster of the missing daughter and the administration trying to upend their lives and get them out of the country was an awful emotional burden to have to bear. And they spoke of that privately, if not publicly.
John Lennon's 1968 drug arrest in London had already made life difficult for him. U.S. laws are very strict concerning convicted drug users.
When John wanted to get into the States at first and to move there, we had tremendous problems getting visas and whatnot. And it didn't help that in public he was liable to say anything about the Vietnam War.
President Richard M. Nixon is the sort of authority that John Lennon delights in taunting. A series of anti-Nixon concerts will give Lennon an unprecedented stage.
So somebody rang us up and said
he had a talent for rubbing the powers that be, the wrong way. He could do it. He'd do it in his sleep. He's a natural.
John Lennon doesn't know it, but the file on him is already growing. His inner circle has been infiltrated by informants, and his writings and songs are being scrutinized for hidden meanings. There's a point to all this spying. Get Lennon out of the U.S.
All right.
Since making friends with the luminaries of the radical left like Jerry Rubin and Bobby Seale, John Lennon has attracted the attention and the ire of the right. The pressure is on to get him before he can use his considerable popularity to influence the 1972 presidential election.
If you stay in the country, will you pursue your activism?
Well, I don't know what active is, you know. I mean, we're sort of like journalists who sing and write about it. I'd always look at every offer to help very thoroughly and decide the pros and cons.
February 1972. John and Yoko are burning up the airwaves. Not only are they on talk shows like Dick Cavett and Mike Douglas, but they're often on the nightly news. John and Yoko use the reflected glare from the spotlights trained on them to let activist friends like Jerry Rubin shine.
Jerry Rubin. It's like a whole cultural renaissance is about to begin. Because all the people that say that the movement, the revolution is over, they ought to see what's going on right here, because it doesn't look over to me. This is like a dream.
John Lennon is the man who's drawing the crowds. February 4th, 1972. While John and Yoko show their support for their friends on the left, a personal and confidential memo is circulating between the Immigration Service and the Senate.
There was a memo sent to the Nixon White House, came from Strom Thurmond, the Republican senator from South Carolina. It outlined Lennon's plan for this national concert tour to register young people to vote.
The confidential memo reads, quote, "Radical New Left leaders intend to use John Lennon as a drawing card to promote the success of rock festivals and rallies. This will pour tremendous amounts of money into the coffers of the New Left and can only inevitably lead to a clash between a controlled mob organized by this group and law enforcement officials in San Diego," unquote.
And it concluded, if Lennon were deported, it would be a strategic countermeasure. That's a quote from one of the documents I managed to get a copy of.
Within a month, the government is working hard to kick John Lennon out of the country. Until John Lennon's FBI file is declassified, only the public legal documents can explain what is happening. March 6, 1972, the Immigration and Naturalization Service serves John and Yoko with a deportation order.
Well, yeah, we're a bit shocked, you know.
Why? Because?
Because our daughter's here. We still haven't found her. We got a
That
piece
means
of
that
paper.
I can't see my daughter. It's a civil case, and I have custody papers, but I can't find her.
Do you have any idea where the child is right
She
now?
was in Texas when Mr. Cox opened the proceedings there, but as we began to win, he left. And we don't know where he is, and nobody knows where he is, neither the sheriff nor the judge who put the order. Nobody's got an idea.
And if we have to go out of this country now, that means that it's synonymous to losing my child, you see, it really is. And I really don't want to do that, so it's very important for us.
What's the child's name? Kyoko.
All I care is really her happiness, so I just feel that she needs to see her mother as well as to see her father.
Why have you been seeking her custody?
John Lennon was subject to deportation by the United States because allegedly of some drug use in England. I was a consultant on the case and worked with his very excellent deportation lawyer, Leon Wildes, in preventing that deportation.
That 1968 drug bust in London makes John Lennon and Yoko Ono vulnerable. Since under U.S. law, a conviction for possession is enough to deport someone from the country.
Isn't this a relatively minor kind of a charge to hold against a person?
The conviction for marijuana? No. Unfortunately, the law denounces it, and while that stands, there's no form of relief that's possible in his case. This is the law, and there's no way of overcoming that.
It was, of course, a total pretense. He was being deported because of who he was and his songs and his involvement in the peace movement. He was one of those people, one of those allegedly dangerous radicals who the United States wanted to get rid of.
They're even sort of changing their own rules to get us, you know, just because we're peaceniks, really.
You don't think there's any possibility that the government is trying to harass the Lennons?
Absolutely not. This is the kind of treatment we would dish out to anybody convicted of a narcotics offense.
A few friends of ours in the pop business have exactly the same conviction as me and are allowed to come and go as free as they like. They just don't happen to have the same point of view as me, or they don't state it.
Will you now stop speaking out against the war?
No, nothing will stop me, and whether I'm here or wherever I may be, I'll always have the same feelings and say what I feel, you know.
Many celebrities speak on behalf of John and Yoko.
After they'd been on one of the two shows I did with them, he said, "Do you mind coming down and sort of standing up for me in front of the legal folks in the court?" And I didn't hesitate, I hope. I said, absolutely.
You know, that drug bust was the only thing that the government had to go on to say, we don't allow offenders to come in, you know, these drug offenders to come into the country. They were trying very hard to keep John out, and he was fighting it all the way. I mean, it did scare him. He really wanted to stay in this country.
Well, I've met a lot of New Yorkers who complain about it, but nobody moves out. It's the greatest place on earth.
We're artists, you know. For artists, it's really a very stimulating place.
New York is what Paris was in whenever Paris was for artists, and this is the center of the art world, and we want to be in the center.
Covert surveillance continues, but Lennon manages to hang on. Soon, the secrets of that surveillance will be revealed. A shocking murder will lead to the unraveling of John Lennon's FBI files. John Lennon continues to be the focus of FBI attention. So far, only rumors supported by the Strom-Thurmond memo are circulating. The real story of who is investigating John Lennon and why they are doing it is still classified. The hard evidence is in the secret files.
Lennon claimed that this drug record was just a pretext for kicking him out of the country because of his political activism, his anti-war stand, and his outspoken criticism of Nixon. What Lennon said seemed plausible. On the other hand, the law was the law at that time.
The secret investigation remains secret, but it has profound effects. John Lennon never headlines a series of concerts. The explosive counter-demonstration at the 1972 Republican National Convention never materializes. Richard M. Nixon wins re-election in a stunning landslide.
So what happened in immigration court, Lennon was constantly under a 60-day order to leave the country, starting in basically February 1972, and they would keep getting that delayed and extended, but for almost 2 years, the threat of deportation within a month or two was hanging over his head continuously.
The controversy settles down into a long, drawn-out court fight to secure green cards for the famous couple. After years of court battles, in 1976, he and Yoko Ono win the right to stay in the U.S.
Former Beatle John Lennon was shot and killed in front of his home on Manhattan's Upper West Side tonight.
John Lennon was shot at 1 West 72nd Street. He was removed to Roosevelt Hospital.
John Lennon is one of the saddest stories, the what if he had lived, but also what if the FBI had not gone after him. I think everybody remembers him as an artist and a musician, and a declining number of people remember that he was considered an enemy of the state.
It's the only case I won that I wish I had lost. If I had lost that case, John Lennon would have been deported to England, and Chapman would have been able to shoot him on the streets of Central Park.
The shock of Lennon's death is felt around the world. For millions, he is more than just a rock and roll hero, more than just a songwriter. John Lennon is also an icon of the peace movement.
They're just saying that to get people to leave. He's not dead. John Lennon can't be dead.
It's like shooting a friend. You know, it's like a death in the family.
If it really happens, John Lennon was the greatest person in the world.
He held aloft a light in a world made dark by war and violence.
His violent death is at odds with everything he stood for, and his age makes the loss not just shocking but tragic. The voice of a generation has been silenced.
Well, I was a Lennon fan, of course. I'm part of the generation that grew up with the Beatles, and when Lennon was shot in December of 1980, I wanted to write something about him.
1981. Professor John Wiener asks the FBI to declassify John Lennon's files. He seeks the help of the American Civil Liberties Union. The tool they use is the Freedom of Information Act, a law enacted in 1966.
It says that not only does the government belong to the people, but the government's documents belong to the people. And if the government has any document that you want, you have a right to request it, and they are obligated to give you a copy unless the document you requested falls under a very narrow number of exemptions.
The FBI provides the pages they deem acceptable for release. Many of these are heavily redacted. A black marker has been used to blot out sensitive information.
So the FBI says, we have this file, 275 pages, we're withholding most of 200 pages or something like that under these various exemptions, mostly the national security exemption. You have a right to appeal. If your appeal is denied, you have a right to go to court.
The battle goes on for decades. FBI agents are deposed, judgments are brought, and bit by bit, John Lennon's FBI file is given to Professor Wiener.
We have two documents side by side. The page of the Lennon FBI file that was originally released to us, mostly blacked out. And then the same page that was released under the settlement, where you can see exactly what they were keeping secret all those years.
The first files the FBI releases don't support the idea that Lennon is somehow a threat to the U.S. The argument about national security falls apart. The second justification the FBI gives for secrecy is to protect the identity and confidentiality of FBI informants. But then a surprising ally pops up.
Out of the blue, I get a phone call from a woman who says she's Julie Maynard and that she was one of the FBI's confidential informants supplying information about John Lennon.
More pages are about to be released.
And so we submitted a statement to the court from Julie Maynard in which she said, "This is who I am. To the extent the government wants to keep my identity secret, that's not for my benefit they're doing that." And once again, I think that undermined any surface appeal that the government's argument had.
A more serious section of the file indicates that the FBI knew what was at stake for John and Yoko. The Bureau knew about their search for Kyoko, Yoko's missing daughter.
This actually comes up in the FBI file in a couple of places, that they're trying to find Kyoko.
John Lennon's history with drugs is also in the files.
Lennon, it says, is known to be a user of narcotics known as downers, and if Lennon were to be arrested on possession of narcotics charges, he would become more immediately deportable. And this information should be disseminated to the appropriate police agencies, especially in Miami, where the Republican National Convention was going to be held. This seems to me like a proposal to set Lennon up for a drug bust so they can get him out of the country before the election.
The final secret of John Lennon's FBI file is that issues of national security and the privacy of informants are secondary concerns. The government is protecting its own rights to keep secrets for political purposes.
We know that in the highest reaches of the Nixon administration, all the way up to the president, including his top advisors, there was genuinely paranoid fear about the impact of John Lennon and an effort to deport him and remove him from the country solely based on his political efficacy. At times it went to ridiculous lengths.
And the thing that is the most interesting commentary is that the FBI seems to have terminated its COINTEL program on Lennon immediately the week after Nixon was reelected in November 1972.
The FBI was working along with the Nixon White House and the Immigration Service to try to build the case to deport Lennon. That's really what Lennon's FBI file is about.
So it was all about using an undercover agency to hound somebody, an artist, from bringing his enormous authority and talent into politics during an election.
But the story of John Lennon and his FBI file doesn't end there. There are still 10 pages of the original 275 that are being fought over in court.
The 10 pages that are still withheld and that the ACLU is still fighting the release of, they have told us, are being withheld because they contain information provided by a foreign government under an explicit promise of confidentiality. We're not even allowed to know the name of the foreign government. That is classified. Now, we could speculate, it's probably not Afghanistan, it's probably Britain.
Decades after his death, new secrets are still coming to light about government surveillance of John Lennon. Perhaps John Lennon put it best himself when he wrote, "Just give me some truth."